true fighter isn't someone who gets into rings simply with the idea to beat people up just for the sake of it. A true fighter is someone who understands that the real fight is always against themselves. In a competitive fight, you'll get to see where you truly stand in the world of combat sports and life in general, as you're basically facing yourself with your opponent acting like a mirror. During his years as an active competitor, Kiyoshi Tamura was a true fighter with a great level of discipline and skill, and he was great at what he did. Kiyoshi Tamura was born on December 17, 1969, in Okayama, Japan. When he was young, he admired Tatsumi Fujinami and aspired to become a professional wrestler. Tamura did some sumo while he was in high school. In 1988, he took and passed the newborn UWF entrance test. Tamura made his pro wrestling debut in newborn UWF in 1989, and he quickly showed progression in his first few years, as he was already a good worker by 1992. One of Tamura's top opponents in the early days of UWF-I was Yoji Anjo, with whom he had a couple of great matches. In the early 1990s, Tamura received guidance from wrestling legends Lou Thesz and Billy Robinson. Over the course of Tamura's career, he would be able to blur the lines between pro wrestling fiction and reality through his amazing ability to work realistic-looking matches, relatively speaking. Yet he was also able to compete in shoot competition quite successfully. Just to be clear here, for those who aren't familiar with certain pro wrestling terms that will be used in this video, a work match is a match with a predetermined outcome, and a shoot fight is a legit contest with an unplanned outcome. On May 8, 1992, at a UWF-I event in what was billed as a martial arts fight, Tamura beat American boxer Matthew Saad Muhammad in 34 seconds. This was Kiyoshi Tamura's first shoot fight, but while it was a nice win, it was against an opponent who obviously was unprepared and or didn't know what he was getting into. This was also before the start of Pancrase and UFC, so people didn't really know what MMA was, especially since the term MMA hadn't even been coined yet. At some point in the late 90s, the Rings League, which Tamura was competing in at the time, decided to focus more on shoot fights instead of having mostly worked matches, which meant that the overall style of rings changed to an even more realistic-looking style than previously. This resulted in several cases where it wasn't clear for the viewers whether or not Tamura's matches were complete works, partial works, or complete shoots. This speaks volumes about Tamura's ability as both a worker and a shooter. Tamura had one of the best pro wrestling matches of the 1990s whenever he had battled against top-level opponents, such as Yoshihisa Yamamoto, Volk Han, and Tsuyoshi Kosaka, all of whom he had several memorable matches with. When he wasn't competing in shoot fights and had worked matches, Tamura would always work shoot-style pro wrestling matches and never the regular, relatively more unrealistic, pro wrestling kind of matches. If a league like New Japan Pro Wrestling, for example, would be considered regular puroresu, which is generally still more realistic than the more entertainment-oriented American leagues, one could say that even within the realm of the shoot-style puroresu leagues, which were leagues that generally tried to be as realistic as possible, relatively speaking, there was a difference between the slightly more flashy and entertaining style of UWF-I, for example, and the slightly more serious and even more realistic style of rings. Of course, this would also depend on the people in the matches, as there was obviously quite a variety in terms of not only skill level, but also styles and backgrounds. Even though Tamura had participated in at least a few shoot matches prior, including a 55-second win over UFC 2 finalist Patrick Smith at a K1 event on December 9th, 1995, and possibly some rings matches that may or may not have been partial shoots or shoots, the first fight in the true shoot era of Tamura's career, which was the part of his career in which he mainly started competing in shoots and started leaving behind his work pro wrestling roots, was a win at the Ring's December 22nd, 1999 event over American fighter Dave Menne, who would go on to become the first UFC middleweight champion in 2001. Tamura's shoot fights weren't as exciting as his work matches because Tamura was such an incredibly skilled worker that it was pretty much impossible to incorporate that level of excitement into actual shoots, since it wouldn't make sense to be spectacular when the priority was now to actually beat the opponents, regardless of how entertaining the match is. In 2003, Tamura had his own league, U-Style, which was a shoot-style pro wrestling league that largely featured Tamura's students from Tamura's martial arts gym, U-File Camp. U-Style was a great league that managed to revive shoot-style wrestling at a time when pretty much all shoot-style wrestling had died out. After U-Style ended, Tamura started focusing mostly on shoots during the remaining years of his career. The closest thing that Tamura ever did that resembled regular pro wrestling was when he faced Amazon Goliath, Montaña Silva, on September 8, 2007 in IGF, which was arguably the worst work match Tamura had ever been involved in, all due to Silva being terrible, of course. This turned out to be one of Tamura's last few worked matches. Tamura retired as an active fighter at the age of 47 in 2017 after having lost his final 3 shoot fights in the Ganryujima League in 2016 and 2017. The unusual rules of Ganryujima and the fact that Tamura was entering his late 40s probably have a lot to do with him not being as successful in Ganryujima as initially hoped for. Technically, one could say that Tamura actually won his final 3 MMA fights in 2007 and 2008 in Dream and K1, since the Ganryujima League isn't considered traditional MMA and doesn't follow the unified rules of MMA. Some of the more well-known names Tamura was able to beat in shoots were fighters such as Renzo Gracie, Pat Miletich, Nobuhiko Takada, Masakatsu Funaki, and Kazushi Sakuraba. Tamura was a really good MMA and shoot fighter, but he was truly a great shoot-style pro wrestler. His ability to carry opponents in work matches was possible through his great understanding of how to elevate the quality of the matches without losing too much in terms of credibility and realism. As a worker, he was able to combine realism and spectacle in such an amazing way that virtually no other worker has ever truly been able to master it on that level. Lidet Entertainment, former parent company of Noah, founded GLEAT in the summer of 2020, and this was made possible after Lidet Entertainment president Hiroyuki Suzuki had a meeting with Kiyoshi Tamura on January 25, 2020, to share ideas for the creation of a new league. Tamura became an executive director for this league, and one of his main visions for GLEAT was that it should have shoot-style matches on a regular basis to set them apart from what other leagues were doing. GLEAT created a sub-brand called Lidet UWF, which promotes the shoot-style matches on the GLEAT cards that are contested under UWF rules. And GLEAT also has a sub-brand called G Pro Wrestling, which is represented by matches on the cards that are contested under regular pro wrestling rules and are more of the pro lucha variety. My overall conclusion of Kiyoshi Tamura's career. In this overall conclusion, only Kiyoshi Tamura's work performances were taken into consideration. Tamura truly started excelling at being a shoot-style pro wrestler during the early 1990s. He was the top worker in UWF-I from the outset. In 1993 and 1994, in spite of UWF-I mainly focusing on Nobuhiko Takada, Super Vader, and Gary Albright, which seemingly meant that Tamura subsequently was being lost in the shuffle in terms of position on the card, Tamura gave the strong performances, no matter who he was facing and no matter what his position on the card was, making the most of the situation he was facing. He was arguably the best pro wrestler in the world during the late 1990s and mid 2000s. And some of his performances during the late 1990s in rings were some of the very best performances in pro wrestling history. With his large resume of high-quality shoot-style matches, in which he often elevated his opponents to greater heights, Tamura certainly deserves to be considered one of the greatest pro wrestlers ever. He always remained true to his style, even when he started doing more shoots. Whenever he would get back to having more work matches, he showed that he was still great at doing shoot-style works. When we look at the evidence of his fascinating career, Tamura truly has to be considered one of the greatest professional wrestlers ever. Here is a list of Kiyoshi Tamura's 20 best matches.